Okay, good morning, everyone. We'll get started. I'll just share the results of the poll that I had shared on screen. And yeah, you can see that this is obviously such a big and important topic in terms of Scope 3, with such a high percentage, obviously stating that more than 80% of the emissions portfolio are Scope 3. So thank you for voting. It's really interesting to see that. Okay, so welcome to our 5th webinar in our Reducing Scope 3 emission series. And today we're going to be looking at waste-related emissions covered by categories 5 and 12 of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 3 standard. Just want to take this opportunity to thank our partners for the series, PA Consulting, Owen Mumford and Shoesmiths. And also, before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. So firstly, the event will be recorded and it'll be made available on demand after the session. So don't worry about making too many notes as we go through. We're also activating automatic captions, which you can choose to accept in the tools bar in Zoom. Just a caveat, these captions are generated automatically by Zoom, so do forgive any typos or errors that might be made. And finally, we've scheduled a lot of time for the Q&A at the end of the session. So please, as we go through the presentations, feel free to put any questions which you want to ask to our panelists in the Q&A box. And you've also got the option to vote up any questions which you like the look of. Ultimately, the moderator will likely be taking questions that have the highest number of votes. So choose carefully where you do vote. But please keep the questions out of the chat box. You can use the chat box for any introductions or useful links. We'll be posting some useful links in there as well. But as I say, questions in the Q&A and anything else in the chat box. Okay, so with that, I'm delighted to hand over to Steve Kenzie, UN Global Compact Network UK Executive Director. Thank you for joining and hope it'll be a good session. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks very much, Patrick, and welcome everyone. Looking forward to today's session very much. Before we get started though, just a little bit more necessary housekeeping, unfortunately. We do just need to continue, I think, to raise awareness of the absolutely horrible situation in the Ukraine. The speed of developments has been unprecedented. As of this morning, nearly 6 million Ukrainian refugees have crossed borders seeking safety, and the numbers continue to rise. Every day we're updating that number. And there are also over 8 million people displaced internally within the country. It's a truly horrific situation. In response, the UN High Commission for Refugees, the UN Refugee Agency, has stepped up its operations and its capacity across the Ukraine and neighboring countries. You can support their emergency response by making a donation, or even better, by donating goods or logistical support. The UN Global Compact, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and the Connecting Business Initiative have created a business guide to the Ukraine humanitarian crisis with information about how your business can help the situation. My colleagues have put some links in the chat. Anything you could do would be really important. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. And before we get going any further, we are duty bound to tell you just a little bit about the UN Global Compact. We are the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. We have over 15,000 companies around the world and 4,000 more non-businesses that have made the commitment to our 10 principles to support corporate sustainability. These universal principles are derived from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. To join the Global Compact, if you're not already in an organization which is a member, I would encourage you to look into it. Your CEO needs to make 3 commitments. First, to operationalize the Global Compact principles throughout your operations. Second, to report annually on the progress towards doing so. And finally, to support the wider UN development agenda, which at the moment is best represented by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Here at the UK Network, our mission is to support companies that have made these commitments. We seek to raise ambition for corporate sustainability and to enable practical action. We have 3 main work streams: business and human rights, climate action, and global goals. And we deliver more than 100 events a year to support our members and, of course, the wider business community to be more sustainable. We'll tell you about some of our upcoming events at the end of today's session, and my colleagues, again, have put some links in the chat that can take you to more information about our programming and how to join. Okay, and now on to the program for today. We have 3 fantastic speakers to share their wisdom. We're going to start with Emma Watson, Net Zero Senior Manager at CDP and the Science Based Targets Initiative. Then we're going to hear from Kim McCann, the Global Head of Sustainability for Consumer and Manufacturing at PA Consulting. And finally, Dr. Warren Bowden, Head of Sustainability and Innovation at the Scottish Leather Group. We'll have brief presentations from each of them, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. So do please start using that Q&A box just as soon as you're ready. Now, one last slide from me before I hand over to Emma, just to introduce today's topic. The corporate value chain, aka Scope 3 accounting and reporting standard, allows companies to assess their entire value chain emissions impact and identify where to focus reduction activities. There are 15 Scope 3 categories defined in the standard. Today, we'll be looking at 2 of those categories that relate to waste. Category 5, waste generated in operations, and this category includes emissions from third-party disposal and treatment of waste generated in the reporting company's owned or controlled operations in the reporting year. It also includes, this means emissions from the disposal of both solid waste and wastewater. We'll also be considering category 12, the end-of-life treatment of sold products. And this includes emissions from the waste disposal and treatment of products sold by the reporting company in the reporting year at the end of their life. This category includes the total expected end-of-life emissions from all products sold in the reporting year. Okay, and now I'm delighted to hand over to Emma. She's going to tell us a bit more about the Science Based Targets Initiative and Scope 3. Emma, over to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. And thank you to everyone on the line for listening. It's exciting to see so many of you here today. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the Science Based Targets Initiative, target setting when it comes to waste. So if we can go on to the next couple of slides, please. So the Science Based Targets Initiative was formed around the time of the Paris climate talks back in 2015. So we've been around for a few years now. And we're a partner organization. So we are made up of colleagues from 4 different NGOs, CDP, UN Global Compact, who we're here with today, the World Resources Institute, and WWF. So we were set up at a time when it was unknown for companies how they could align with the Paris Agreement goals. So what we set out to do is to help companies set targets to align their greenhouse gas emission reductions to a Paris-aligned temperature goal. So we're very nearly on the cusp of having 3,000 companies within the Science Based Targets Initiative. Hopefully we'll break that barrier next week. With about half of those companies already having their targets approved, and just over 1,000 of those also committed to setting net zero targets, as well as the near-term science-based targets. So that's a very quick overview of the Science Based Targets Initiative. And what we do is help companies, as I mentioned previously, set targets in line with Paris temperature goals. So we do a few things. First of all, we create standards and methodologies for companies to set, first of all, near-term science-based targets. So this is an essential element of what any company within the Science Based Targets Initiative must do. So these are 5 to 10-year targets that ensure that what the company is doing is aligned with keeping temperature goals below 1.5 C. We also have released the net zero standard in October of last year. So this provides methodologies for companies to set long-term science-based targets to align with the net zero goals at the planetary level. And then, of course, there's always an annual disclosure process that companies would report on their progress against targets. So very simply, science-based targets show companies how much and how fast they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to prevent the worst effects of climate change. So if we move on to the next slide, please, we'll now kind of zoom in slightly on scope 3. So companies within the science-based targets initiative would have to set both scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 targets. But of course, the focus of today's session is on scope 3. And there are 4 considerations that companies need to take into account when setting science-based targets, both for those near-term targets and long-term science-based targets. Now, because of the challenges related to scope 3 and the, I guess, sometimes lack of reliability of the data and the fact that there may be less influence, the Science-Based Targets Initiative does allow for some more flexibility on scope 3. But saying that, all companies at a minimum and at a very minimum must complete a scope 3 screening. So that's a high-level estimate of all of the scope 3 emissions and at least have some understanding of all of the impacts within their value chain. We encourage companies to then move up the data hierarchy and improve those calculations over time. So going back to the 4 considerations, so the first thing that companies need to think about is the boundary of their targets. So how much of their emissions inventory should be included within the target boundary. So for near-term science-based targets, really heavy emitters may not have to include scope 3. So if your scope 3 as a total percentage of your carbon footprint is over 40%, then you have to include 67% of your scope 3 emissions. So if it's less than 40% and you're in a very high emitting sector, you may not have to include it. However, for most companies, as shown by the poll that Patrick had up on the screen earlier, do have the vast majority of their emissions in scope 3. So it tends to be that most companies are including scope 3. In the long term, to align with net zero, all companies have to include scope 3 and they have to include 90% of their scope 3 emissions. When it comes to the level of ambition that companies are aiming for, again, there's more flexibility in the near term. So with scope 3 targets, they have to align to well below 2°C temperature goal. But for long-term science-based targets, we're really aiming for aligning with net zero and 1.5°C pathways. So all scopes have to align to 1.5°C. So there's an increase in ambition over time. When it comes to the time frame, near-term science-based targets are 5 to 10-year targets, and the long-term targets are to be reached by 2050 at the latest. And then we also have a variety of methods that companies can use, and I won't go into those into too much detail today, but they do range from absolute targets to different types of intensity targets. There could be physical intensity, economic intensity, and as well as there's an option for supplier engagement targets in the near term as well. So now moving on to the next slide, we're talking today about waste, and Steve already kind of went into that, but there are 2 scope 3 categories that are related to waste within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The first is category 5, waste generated in own operations, and the second is category 12, which is end-of-life treatment of sold products. And if we go on to the next slide, please. Again, Steve already went into this, but you can find this table within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It's table 5.4. It's an extremely useful table for understanding what the minimum requirements are to include within your greenhouse gas footprint. So what we can really see here is that for companies who have waste generated in their operations or from their sold products, the minimum requirement is that companies would include the scope 1 and 2 emissions of the waste management suppliers for disposal or treatment of either their own waste or for products. So that's the minimum requirement that would be included within your footprint. However, if we go on to the next slide, what we see here is that for most sectors, so it's a very kind of small image, so you have to squint slightly, but what it shows is emissions broken down by category for scope 3 by sector. So it's a hotspot analysis that the SBTi has done. It's an informal analysis, but what we can see here is that actually these two categories tend to be fairly immaterial for many different sectors. However, what tends to be very material, you'll see, is scope 3 category 1, which is purchased goods and services. And I think that is really where the opportunity lies when it comes to waste. And I think you'll hear more about this from our following speakers, is that we can use waste to reduce the emissions of the products that we buy. So that's really the key opportunity. So the target setting element around scope 3, I think, when it comes to emission reductions, isn't as exciting as when we think about the opportunity for circularity. So I think sometimes it's a kind of I guess the importance of this category can be underplayed, because you look at emissions footprint and it comes up as small. So there may not be as much focus on it when it comes to emission reduction target setting, but that's not to say that it's not important. And there are also impacts on other sustainable development goals. So very quickly, on the next slide, I'll just show you some examples of targets. So AstraZeneca, they have included both waste generated in their operations and end-of-life treatment of sold products within their science-based targets, and they've committed to reduce those emissions by 46% by 2030. Burger King UK, they have included waste generated in operations. So their goal is to reduce that 41% per restaurant by 2030. And finally, Tesco, they've also included a waste goal within their target to reduce those emissions 17% by 2030. So just to end very quickly, I think these slides will be distributed, but there's a whole host of resources on our website to help with scope 3 target setting, but I will hand over to our next speakers now to talk to you in more detail.
Thanks so much, Emma. We've had already some interesting questions come into the Q&A, and a couple of them I think probably better suited to a written answer if you don't mind taking those on. But now let's move on to hear from Kim.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. So I'm Kim McCann from PA Consulting, and what we do is really look at ingenious and innovative ways that we can help build a positive human future. And today I'm going to talk to you about some examples of how we've helped our clients with both their process waste, as we've heard in category 5 here, but also really in moving their business model towards circularity. The key message from this section I want you to take away is that you cannot just innovate in a technology sense to look at reducing your emissions. The real key here is to innovate your business models as well, to move much more towards circular business models. So if we go on to the next slide, please, I'll quickly talk to 4 examples. The top 2 here are examples of where we have helped with waste byproducts, let's call them, rather than waste, from existing process, from manufacturing process. And the bottom 2 are more ingenious new ideas and companies that are actually helping address more circular solutions for waste. The first one, the Dole pineapple one here, this is one where we've done what most companies start this journey with in the maturity, which is looking at how can I reduce the waste that I have from production. So we used, and this is for pineapple picking, it was pineapple waste, the husks around the outside of the pineapple, for when you then buy Dole pineapple chunks in a tub. We first helped them really understand how to reduce that waste, which was done by manual picking and checking which pineapple manually was most ripe. We used innovative technology solutions to then help reduce that waste through the picking process, but also then in looking at really what was the most ripe and best pineapples to use. So that started to reduce the amount of waste very significantly that Dole have in that process. What we're now helping them do to move more circularly is looking at how that waste that does still exist, once you've reduced it down, how can they then use that, which is a cellulose, essentially it's the husk of pineapple, how can they use that with innovative techniques to turn that back into packaging for their own products, so that then starts to become much more circular. Similarly, the next one with the beer company, one of the world's biggest brewers. This again is where we looked at byproduct waste. It was brewers spent yeast, and many brewers and distillers as well, you will be aware, are doing basically creating their own energy out of a lot of their waste, which is good. We done an analysis on their deep technical analysis on their brewer spent yeast, and we worked out the best way to maximize value from it was actually to take it through one additional processing step and turn it into a feedstock to go into the mascara and lipstick in the cosmetics industry. Now, that's not completely circular in their own process, but it's a whole new business model that is not just reduced the emissions from their own operations, but is actually then helping reduce the emissions in production from the cosmetics industry as well. So now you've got a brewer who's set up a whole separate venture now so that their byproducts become feedstocks into the cosmetics industry. That's where you start to see that really innovative thinking about how a company actually makes money from its traditional way of making money, which was just from the beer. The bottom two here are companies that we've worked with who are innovators in using that end of life and waste and finding new lives for it. So people that big producers could start to partner with more to look at how you can become more circular. EcoBooth is a sustainable events company, and we do believe that each corporate event that we have on average produces enough waste to be the equivalent of 1.8 million plastic bottles. Corporate events produce a phenomenal amount of waste, and obviously EcoBooth wanted to find a way to really address that. What we helped them do was work out how they could take end-of-life plastic waste that was destined for landfill, incineration, and other unsustainable practices, and how to take that and turn it into reusable booths for corporate events. And that's what the Eco Booth is. It's made from reusable, and it itself is completely recyclable and reusable. So it's no longer one-use booths for events. Similarly, the last one here on this slide before we go on to the next is UBQ Materials. UBQ is a B Corp startup that we worked with, and they again intercept landfill destined waste, and they, through their innovative technology that we've helped them develop, they then turn that into a usable plastic, a usable thermoplastic again. So it's actually intercepting what would have gone to landfill, mixed municipal waste, and giving it a whole new life as reusable plastics that can be turned back into products. If we go into the next one, please. So that starts to tell you some of the different ways and technologies that, and people that are doing really innovative things here with us, that end of life type waste. You are really now starting to see circularity and circular business models be brought to life by real majors. And I've got some examples here around this circle that shows what some are doing. And I'll go into more detail on some of this in the next slide. But you are seeing the likes of retailers, for example. We're working with retailers just now who are looking at investing in and acquiring mechanical recyclers. Again, completely different bit of the value chain from where a retailer would normally be. But with the extended producer responsibility regulations coming in that really push on plastic waste, the cost of waste, push it back to really the source of that cost, which can be in the retailers or in the brand owners, you're seeing that regulation trigger innovative thinking on how different retailers can no longer just be a retailer, but play into the actual full life cycle of plastics and packaging that they then manage. And you're seeing really new innovative technologies come up with what you may have heard of as chemical recycling. So this is for what we call the really hard to recycle plastics, not the stuff you can mechanically recycle, but the stuff traditionally you couldn't. So the films, the food contaminated waste, the foils, the bread bags and the bagels come in, those sorts of things. You are now seeing partnerships between the likes of Dow and Mura, where Mura can take that waste of plastic bags and things, and they can turn it through their processes back into a feedstock that the likes of Dow can take to produce new films. So it does become more circular. And you're seeing them then feed that back to the likes of Unilever, who will then use it to put back into their products, package their products in again. So starting to really close those loops. But these innovative technologies and things like chemical recycling are the key to taking the linear model and actually bending it round into a circle. You're now even seeing the big super majors and energy companies, the ones where a lot of the fossil-derived petrochemical products and plastics and things, you're seeing them really start to make moves in this area now, and they're moving in fast because they see that this industry is moving quickly, and that to really get market share, you have to get in now because it's accelerating at speed. And a lot of that, to be honest, has been driven by some of the big brand owners, the Coca-Colas, the Unilevers. You're really seeing them get into the value chain entirely. Lidl, for example, there have got completely closed loop systems now, and a whole separate entity that is a service entity for doing closed loops plastics and recycling, because they had the problem, they solved it for themselves first, and now they have it set up as a business they can solve for others. So I think the key thing here is companies need to move to these circular models fast. So if we go into the next one, I'll give you one in the last slide. I'll talk through some of that example, and you can see again some of these companies that are moving around this. This again is the food packaging circular value chain example, where food manufacturers are making the food and packaging it, giving it to the retailers. It's then coming to you and I as consumers who will buy that food from the supermarket, consume it, and then end of life, it's going into the waste. That's then getting, for those of us who are lucky enough to live in countries that have curbside recycling or sortation, that then goes in and gets sorted, and some of it comes back and creates more new plastics again. But what about the rest of it that can't, that gets intercepted? That's where these new companies come in to really bend that linear model that would be going to end of life into actually a circle, being able to take that end of life packaging, intercept it before it gets to landfill or incineration, and actually turn it back into feedstocks for what would have been the petrochemical industry, displacing fossil inputs into that. And those feedstocks can then go back down to either create fuels that could go back to the manufacturers of food or the retailers to decarbonize their supply chain, so decarbonize their transport. Or it can also then go back round and get turned into products again. That means you take that plastics back round, back to the food manufacturers or back to the retailers, so that they know their plastics coming out is coming straight back round as much as they can back into and being avoided from going to landfill and incineration. And at end of life, it's coming back round into their supply chain again. So I think the key thing here for me is it is really hard to tackle Scope 3 emissions, but you cannot tackle it in a linear way. You cannot go to your existing linear supply chain of suppliers and customers and expect that to just change and tackle your Scope 3 emissions. You've got to think differently about the business models that you'll do and how you do business to actually bend it round into those circles, and then you really start to attack the end of life of your product and the waste also from production. That's the key to both tackling 5 and 12 categories. And with that, I'll pass on to our next speaker.
Thanks very much, Kim. Great stuff. I think that long-term view, that conclusion that circularity has to be the future, it really is unavoidable, I think. Just a quick update on the questions text. So just a reminder, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions that you would like in the mix for when the Q&A starts, that's the place to put them. We as panelists are not able to copy and paste your questions from the chat into the Q&A. So you need to do that if you've inadvertently posted a question in the chat. We have a lot of questions already there. So also really helpful if you would vote. If you see a question that you're really keen for us to answer, click on the thumbs up and that will move it to the top and significantly improve the likelihood that we're going to answer it. And just in the top right-hand corner of the Q&A box, it may default to most recent up there if you see most recent. And if you click on that, you can put them in the order of most upvoted and just see where things are at. Really happy for the chat to be filled with chat, or if you have technical questions, that's the place for them. But do keep your questions for the panelists coming into the Q&A box. Okay, without any further ado, Warren, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Pleasure to speak to you on behalf of Scottish Leather Group. For those of you who are probably not aware of us, we are the producers of the world's lowest carbon leather. We've been on a journey for about 20 years towards sustainability, more recently circularity of leather manufacture. I'll take you through some of the detail in just a second, but just in reference to the UN, we've been signatories to the UNGC for several years. We're actually currently reporting on all 17 of the SDGs, and for some while reporting on behalf of the 10 principles, which is baked into the activities that we do on a day-to-day basis. Next slide, please. Now, leather manufacturing probably doesn't fit very well in some people's minds with regard to sustainability, but in my mind, and when you get into the nitty-gritty of it, it's actually arguably one of the most sustainable materials on the planet. Man's been making this stuff for tens of thousands of years, long before the climate crisis. So do keep that in mind while you're postulating on that. But just to take you through some of the relevance to Scope 3, two of the biggest elements of our Scope 3 emissions, which we have been reporting on for, as I said, many years, is the raw material, obviously bringing in hides, which are a waste or a byproduct of agriculture, into our factory. Only about 10 or 11% of that raw material actually becomes leather, which perhaps again is a little bit of a surprise to many. So the question then was, well, what about the rest? 90% of that raw material coming in, clearly we've got a huge waste issue. And if you go back to our baseline data back in 2004, we could be pointing to things like 44,000 tons of waste from operations, which obviously is part of our Scope 3, in addition to bringing in the raw materials. So what we chose to do, and this was a decision before anyone was talking about circularity, was to convert that waste into our own form of heat. So on one part, we take all of those other components of the raw material, and we found other homes for it. For example, collagen going into the food sector. Now that currently accounts for something in the order of half of that raw material. And you find it in a variety of sweets and other forms of gelatin, which obviously is commonplace in the food sector. But then you're left with this residual waste. What we've done is to convert that residual waste into heat, use that heat directly in our own factory, directly avoiding the use of fossil fuels. We don't have to buy as much fossil fuel as we would have done. We create as much heat as is equivalent to heating around 5,000 homes directly from within our own plant. So through this whole activity, yes, we've still got the supply chain of the raw materials within our full scope reporting, but our waste Scope 3 data is down by something like 90% from our baseline year. We're capturing at the moment around 90% of that through internalization. What it does mean, of course, is that when you convert your own waste into heat, you can classify it slightly differently. Scope 1 emission, because it's now a heat source displacing fossil fuel. That's been long debated, but also avoiding simply disposal of waste means that you're simply removing those Scope 3 emissions. In addition to that, we also create other forms of energy which are sold. And depending on your treatment of the numbers, by netting off the sale of those bio oils or waste derived oils from the same raw materials, we're actually presenting ourselves with almost a carbon positive position with regard to Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Waste, obviously, as was mentioned in the introduction, is not just about that solid waste that leaves the place in a skip. It's more to do with all sorts of emissions, air and also liquid. Part of that circularity philosophy was also about treating our own source of water. Now we have our own source of water, our own private loch. We take the water, we borrow it in effect, and we put it back through our own treatment plant, back into our own factories. So we don't actually consume water that would naturally be there. When we do discharge that water, and that's approximately 60% of it, it's treated to the point that it returns back into the same watershed. We actually, on balance, and according to the Water Scarcity Index, have a slightly positive water balance. Living on the west coast of Scotland, not surprising, there's plenty of rain, but we actually discharge more than we take in, which is perhaps surprising to others. Next slide, please. Part of that story also is being able to present all of this in a transparent and factual way. We adopted life cycle analysis as a way to try and capture Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, including all of those internalization of waste activities and also the supply chain metrics. And you can see there the two blobs, the one on the right in the blue is the internal activities, what's known as the core activity in relation to making leather. And on the left, mostly the supply chain. Bear in mind that that is a waste from another sector, as in the hide, or a byproduct, depending on where you are in terms of regulation. So we account for all of those supply chain inputs into our LCA. What we're able to do, therefore, in terms of things like long-term carbon reporting, such as with the SBTI, is to use life cycle analysis, which captures Scope 1 and Scope 2 and Scope 3, as well as including the supply chain, multiplied obviously by the number of hides that we actually produce and the different types of hides that we produce. You'll notice there's a range of data in the middle there. Typically our figure for LCA is 8 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per square meter. That's for all scopes. To that we need to add business travel and one or two other minor elements to do with financial investments. But that essentially creates, excuse me, the entire corporate footprint. Delicate balance getting all of this right. For many on the call, and I'm reading some of the questions, there are pluses and minuses, I think, in terms of how you account for and where you allocate these scope intensities. For example, the recovery of energy from waste, not everybody's cup of tea, but actually it's a significant reduction in the overall scope emissions by avoiding fossil fuel, which is interesting, avoiding waste disposal, Scope 3, which is even more interesting, and being able to convert one into the other. And I think that metric actually is perhaps already overstated, but nonetheless represents a significant reduction in both. As I said right at the beginning, for those who perhaps didn't catch it, our footprint has reduced by 90% from our baseline year. And just to put it into context, Scope 1, 2, and 3 since 2018, when we rebase for SBTI, we've reduced already by 50% since 2018. So really the impact of being able to capture your own waste and quantify the supply chain correctly, which is what we've presented here, invaluable in trying to not only set your targets, but also demonstrate achieving them. What you've seen so far is a patented, it's unique process. Some have described what we've done as an industrial epiphany. And for those who are particularly interested in the footprint of materials such as leather, the data we're presenting is at least an order of magnitude below that is commonly or currently presented on some of the public platforms in terms of carbon emissions. That's all from me, Steve.
Fantastic, Warren, and really amazing numbers. I think that, as you note, I mean, that's really an epiphany and quite shocking in a sector that would not normally be associated with such leadership in sustainability. So thanks very much for sharing. Okay, now I think we're going to turn off the slides and we're going to get stuck into these questions, of which we have many. Thanks very much, Emma, for your hard work in getting some of them answered. Maybe we won't go to everyone with every question, just so that we can try and get through more. But Emma, Warren, Kim, if there's a question that you're particularly keen on, yeah, do let me know, and we can steer our way there. But lots of votes for that first question from Rachela about double counting. I think it's not an uncommon question when it comes to scope 3. Maybe Emma, I think I saw that you might have started writing. Do you want to just share that and get us started on that question? Let me read it out in case anybody's not able to see. So, how to avoid double counting, as often emission factors for materials and waste have overlaps. Also, transportation of waste is often included in the emission factors for waste, so one needs to be careful on the interplay between categories and emission factors.
Yeah, I think there's always a danger with scope 3 to have inaccuracies. I think it's always a kind of journey of improvement with scope 3 over time. Everything's always changing. So it is, there are dangers of double counting. It's true that within emission factors for waste, there is often transportation included within that. However, I would probably say that for many companies, it's unlikely that they would then be accounting for the transportation from their facilities from their operations to the facilities. So because of that, it may be kind of may be quite immaterial. I think, more often than not, scope 3 is used as a tool to understand where material impacts are. So I think in reality, probably these kind of small differences, these would be small differences when we're looking at the overall footprint. And I think, as Warren and Kim really clearly showed, that with waste, the real opportunity is turning that into reduced supply chain emissions. So that's really the big opportunity. And I think sometimes with scope 3, we need to make sure that we're thinking about the big picture rather than some kind of quite immaterial differences.
Thanks, Emma.
Can I just add to that a little bit, Steve? So
yeah, sure, yeah.
I find it really interesting that the top questions that are being given the most votes, and the top 2 or maybe even 3, is all about the accounting of this. It's all about the measuring and how it's then reported. My plea to the audience is stop looking down and into that level of detail and stop worrying about that too much, and look up and out into really what's the right thing to do first, and then we'll worry about how it's accounted for. Because these regulations are evolving and will continue to evolve. But I think Warren has shown from what Scottish Leather Group have done as well, you have to do it. You have to just get in there and do the right things to really start to look at resource use in the best way and how you can influence that. So we are literally on a burning planet. We cannot be worrying so much about how we account for things to make sure that the cost works the way the cost always did. We've got to be radically different. And to Chris Halligan, to your question, aren't we then better if there is still emissions from recycling, putting pressure on our waste providers to reduce those? I wouldn't be saying it's putting pressure. You should be going to your waste providers and others in your supply chain and saying, how can we work differently together so that together we reduce your emissions and mine? And it's about being innovative in the way in which you think of that business model, not just as supply chain master, you're a supplier, I'm the provider, I'm paying your bills, you will do what I say. That there is elements where that can work because you will see change when a customer asks, but actually proactively helping do that through different business models and innovative solutions together, I would think that's the right way to do it rather than putting pressure on. And I would say, let's try not to worry too much about the accounting because it is imperfect. And let's make sure we do the right thing to make sure we are using our resources and our energy in the best way possible first.
Thanks.
Can I add a little piece to that as well?
Yeah, sure, Warren, go ahead.
Thank you. I'd just like to add to what Kim was saying. I agree with a lot of that. I think also when you're running a business, you're not just, you're not running it by metrics. From our point of view, that the whole challenge, the risk comes from waste being a threat to the business. So what else do we do with it? And it wasn't so much that we were choosing to do it because of sort of carbon accounting thinking. It was to do with, well, okay, what happens if we can't get rid of our waste? Do we need to find another way of dealing with it? To give an example, 2 of our targets that we've got for 2025 are to be 0 waste to landfill, as opposed to 0 waste, because there's always going to be some kind of waste and it will need to be accounted for, however that is, and 0 carbon emissions on scope 1 and 2. Those 2 things are achievable by the decisions that I think you've seen in front of you. So yeah, corporate decisions, and I wouldn't, as Kim said, look up, it's a bigger picture thing here about not just working with the supply chain, but going beyond that. We need to take control of our own activities. It's your scope 3, not necessarily their scope 1 and 2 that we need to be considering.
Thank you all. That was great. Kim started on this next question from Chris. Is there anything more to add? According to the DEFRA method, recycling, whether closed or open loop, still produces carbon emissions. If this is the case, is a better strategy to put pressure on your waste providers to reduce their own scope 1 and 2 emissions first. Is there anything more to say in that space? I think Kim has addressed that. Let's move on to Lee is building on Chris. The DEFRA emission factors are also the same for sending waste to combustion or for recycling, which isn't promoting the right behaviors. Any thoughts on how this can be overcome? Suppose maybe we take this moment to speak about the role of government in waste and recycling, because I think in my experience, companies are way ahead in this area in providing recyclable packaging and materials, but then municipalities don't have the capacity to recycle that stuff. And so we've got some issues there. Would anyone like to start on that question, perhaps just around government engagement? Maybe Warren, we could come to you on this, and just to what extent have you been engaging government in your work? You've largely, it seems, taken it all on yourselves to sort of sidestep that issue.
Yeah, I have to say it's been a long journey, and we have been working closely with the regulatory guys, as you would expect us to do. We actually helped to write some of the legislation that applies in Scotland because we were the first to do it. And it didn't really fit with any of the, if you like, the conventional activity. I think the key thing was that we had to find a different way to that was linear. And at the time, and I'm going back, 20 years, nobody else was thinking about this. So to try and to go to a regulator, or even to funding, and there was no funding for this sort of thing back then, we had to try and persuade them that what we were trying to do was less damaging, better for us, better for wider environment, by trying to convert our own stuff into our own, internalizing it. One of the definitions we came across, the EU definition of waste, which frankly is a mess. It's only a waste when you discard it, but if you use it internally, when does it become a waste? For example, working with our supply chain as well, because I think many people conceive that a hide is something that we deliberately acquire and create. Well, we don't. It's a waste from another sector. So trying to understand, for example, the carbon footprint of our suppliers, and then who we're buying from, for example, was also part of the decision making. So it's taken all sorts of partnerships and some tap dancing really to come to the right place with regard to who we buy from, what their footprint is, but also even things like creating life cycle analysis. I mean, we had to create that because it didn't exist. You know, the PEP-CR, for example, we were one of the partner organizations in that when it was conceived in about 2014, but it's taken until this last year to really, or last 2 years, to really be able to present this to ISO standard level, which is what we and many other tanneries are now doing. So there's been a whole load of regulatory engagement. I think the stakeholders as well, this is more than just regulators, internal and external, changing the whole sort of philosophy of what we're doing and why we're doing it. It started off with, you know, not having waste because it's a problem, regulatory reasons, but then seeing the benefit of actually converting it and not having that risk, you know, whether it's a balance sheet or otherwise, not having that risk was actually a key piece in gaining the support internally. And I think wider industry adoption of this sort of techniques. It is taking off. I think others will follow what we've done.
Thanks, Warren.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah,
a little
please,
bit,
Kim.
Steve? So in terms of the role of regulators in these evolving regulations that are far from perfect, as we're hearing from the challenges of accounting for it. One example I've got with a client we worked with in that circular packaging piece, actually, that was triggered by the concern and regulation. It was triggered by the EPR coming into the UK. It was going to increase their cost of compliance tenfold. And for most retailers and for producers of product, it will increase their cost of compliance between tenfold right up to 20-odd fold sometimes as well. But actually, when we started to get into the project that was triggered by the concern and the regulation in terms of cost of compliance, what we actually found was that's the tip of the iceberg. The big bit of the iceberg of your problem is not actually your cost of compliance. It's that 0.4% of plastics in the world are recycled. It's actually the big challenge is going to be on getting your hands on that material going forward. That's what will sink your business, will be the cost that you're seeing going up to the northeast on the graph of the recycled content. And that's actually why you're seeing the likes of Lidl and then Coca-Cola and others get into buying mechanical recycling companies, because the regulation triggers something, but actually the impact that things will have in a bigger sense in your business, which is why I'm saying look up and out from just the regulation itself. That's where the real aha moments come. And following on from that, the biggest problem, the head of European regulation for Coca-Cola told me the biggest problem they have is accessing recycled materials, accessing materials to recycle. So now we can tell clients, and we are telling clients, that actually being an aggregator, being someone who will access the materials that the brand owners can't because they don't touch the consumer, someone who can access those materials and bringing it back is going to be a real key strategic control point in the value chain going forward, and is going to be where the value in business is created going forward, but it's not there today. So it's been able in understanding the implications of those regulations, not just on what you're doing today, but the ramifications that's going to have and what the business looks like in 2030 and beyond, and what you do now to get into those circular models, make them, but also get the control within them to be a winner as a business in it going forward.
Thanks, Kim. Okay, we're running out of time quickly. This next question from Yolanda, I think I'm going to steer it your way, Emma. How can companies that outsource operations and transfer responsibility for waste management to their subcontractors account for waste generated and set waste reduction targets? As with upstream leased assets, how can this be addressed? Any thoughts on that?
I'm just taking a moment to absorb the question.
Yeah.
So, okay, companies outsource operations and transfer responsibility for waste management to their subcontractors, account for the waste generated as with upstream. So this is exactly where Scope 3 target setting comes into play. So if you're outsourcing anything, whether it's, you know, leased assets or waste management, then you would set the scope 3 targets on those. So typically, yeah, there, as I kind of explained in the presentation, there's different approaches for setting scope 1 and 2 targets when you're not outsourcing something, and scope 3 when you are outsourcing something. So there, as I explained, there's a bit more flexibility, but there are various different approaches to be able to do that. Hopefully I've answered that question okay.
Yeah, and I think there's a distinction. The waste management is a little bit, almost by definition, isn't it, after the waste has been created. So a lot of, I think, the conversation around reducing your waste-related emissions is in your processes much further upstream in avoiding the creation of that waste as well. Okay, the next question, maybe throw it open to not just the panel, but invite people to put into the chat. But just, is there, from Mark, is there any initiative likely to make plastic recycling more user-friendly? The different codes and logos can be confusing and tending to lead to more waste. Is anybody aware of anything in the pipeline? Maybe we'll leave that. Anybody wants to plug something in the chat, and we'll just keep moving on, because the next question from Rory, talking about end of life, is something we haven't really touched on too much yet. At the moment, the end of life treatment of recycled materials is not included in our scope 3 emissions. This disincentivizes people to recycle, as it means that often there are more carbon emissions associated with recycling compared to general waste. Is there a discussion to change this? Now, I'm not sure, since category 12 specifically speaks to end of life, that Rory's quite got that right. Or again, maybe Emma, could you provide some clarification perhaps on the technical side of that?
So maybe what Rory is saying is that his company sells a product that then consumers are not incentivized to recycle. I think, I mean, first of all, the emissions from the recycled materials should be included within the scope 3 footprint. Companies should be accounting for everything within their impacts. I would be surprised if the day-to-day consumer is not recycling because of the emission factors. I think it's more to do with the fact that there's loads of, I think, mistrust. At least I know, you know, from my kind of just general friends and family about whether things actually get recycled. And I know there's a big campaign actually in London, what you see on the lorries saying, you know, these things do get recycled, please do recycle them. And I think, yeah, the kind of lack of consistency with our recycling systems, I'm not sure how it is outside of the UK, but certainly in the UK, there's a huge lack of consistency. I think there's something, I don't know if anyone else knows the actual figure, but I think we have like 125 different waste management processes within the councils within the UK. And I think having more of a nationwide approach would help the day-to-day consumer to start recycling more and have more trust in the system. But I don't know if the other panelists have any kind of thoughts on that question.
Well, unfortunately, even if they do, we don't have time anymore to hear from them, and I'm really sorry that we're going to have to leave so many questions on the table. We'll see what we can do about addressing some of those afterwards, and putting some more information into the key takeaways from today's session. Huge thank you to Emma and Kim and Warren. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you. I think that Patrick has maybe a couple of slides he's going to put on there while we're winding down. But yeah, again, thanks for your fabulous insights. Thanks very much to our audience for your active engagement and for all of your fantastic questions. Patrick, do you want to just take us out?
Yep, thank you, Steve. I'll just bring up some slides just showing our next events that are coming up. So next in this series, we'll be looking at reducing scope 3 emissions from leased assets. So Emma will be rejoining us for that. And we've also got Landsec confirmed to speak at that session as well. So it should be a really good one. That's on the 26th of May. You may have also seen that we're also running a series in parallel to this one, looking at climate and human rights and building resilience for business. So on the 15th of June, we'll be having our next session in that one, looking at the topic of supply chains. And then also elsewhere in the UN Global Compact Network UK, we'll have another session upcoming on the 24th of May in our Pride Plus Building LGBTIQ Plus Inclusive Businesses series. And that's going to be looking at creating a trans-inclusive workplace. So anything else that you want to keep updated on, feel free to follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn. There's some information there about how you can follow us on those platforms. But yeah, thanks again to the speakers, and thanks again to our partners for the series, PA Consulting, Owen Mumford and Shoesmiths. And most of all, thanks to the attendees for your brilliant engagement and getting involved in today's session. Thank you very much, and I'll look forward to seeing you at the next event.